Hello and welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, December 1st, 2022. The recent actions that particularly the Schiller Institute has taken have placed us in position to propose a set of principles through which a new security and development architecture could in fact be negotiated for the world. Now, this is coming not a moment too soon in that the head of the European Union Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, was proposing a couple days ago the creation not only of a war crimes tribunal, which was supposedly going to put Russians on trial for war crimes, but was also proposing the confiscation of some $300 billion plus worth of Russian holdings that have been frozen. There are various schemes about how that might be done, but these things were being proposed, and of course this kind of discussion it means that you cannot have a peace negotiation. And what has happened is that the declaration has essentially been made that there must be no negotiations with Russia. Now, this is something that was conveyed back in March of this year by Boris Johnson as a way of essentially condemning tens of thousands of people, perhaps even hundreds of thousands, over 100,000 people to their deaths on both the Ukrainian and Russian sides. And, of course, millions have been displaced as a result of this. And this kind of behavior means that the people of the world, in different parts of the world, are going to have to step up. This is a time where the leadership that had been expected or might be expected from heads of state doesn't work. This has happened before in human history, and particularly 100 years ago, during the period of the First World War, and just prior to the First World War. It's a kind of moral failure of leadership which was consummate, and without the presence of Franklin Roosevelt, it's highly possible that the roughly 100 million people that died worldwide in that conflict could have been multiplied by 2, 3, 4 times. Now, that in order for that kind of leadership to manifest itself, it can't be designated from the elites. Lyndon LaRouche wrote something back in 1993 called "On the Subject of the Breakdown of the Elites," and he had the following to say. He said 30 years ago, that meant 1993 this was written, so he was referring to the Kennedy assassination, now nearly 60 years ago. 30 years ago, immediately following the assassination and cover-up of the assassination of U.S. President John F. Kennedy, those forces which had been responsible for authoring the assassination, Anglo-American forces in particular, the same forces who were behind the attempts to assassinate de Gaulle in particular for the same reason, moved for a fundamental change in the cultural disposition of the leading institutions of North America and West Europe. This was an Anglo-American operation coming from a certain section, the extreme liberal section of the Anglo-American oligarchy, from circles typified by such as Bertrand Russell and the Huxley brothers, Aldous and Julian Huxley, and H.G. Wells. This is a project which is sometimes called the Nietzsche Project, the dawning of the age of Aquarius, the superseding of a long period of Christian civilization in Europe by a new phase of civilization or destruction of civilization based on the ideas of Nietzsche and his co-thinkers or co-movement thinkers, the bringing of the age of Dionysius or Aquarius to the fore. It was also an age which was characterized by bringing to an end the attempt to base civilization on the individual process of cognition, as scientific discovery typifies cognition, and to replace that process with a kind of symbolic, affective, emotional, associative reasoning like the ancient feminist cults. Now, that was planned in December of 93. That same year, in November of that year, Lynn gave an interview to an individual from a radio station, Imam Aku Abul Samad. And he gave this interview in prison. And he said the following. He was just asked a question about who he was. And he said, I'm 71 years of age this past September. I'm still pretty frisky. I'm not as frisky physically as I once was. In prison in about 5 years has taken a certain amount out of me, just in terms of passage of time. But I was a young fellow who had some talent, some mental talent, but I wasn't really that significant, except as an individual. But in the 1960s, I recognized that what's called the New Age, or the counterculture, or the rock, drug, sex counterculture, or worship of Satan, which is a politer word for it, that this is the greatest danger that I had ever seen in society. This, and therefore I resolved that I would have to contribute something to resist that, and to helping others to resist that, in particular young people, and in particular college-aged young people. Now, this was back in 1963 and 64, in which they were targeting mostly college-aged young people in colleges. They later went to target more broadly the high school age and younger. It made a youth movement to attempt to destroy a generation or two generations of youth as a way of destroying society. Now, I had no difficulty at the time of understanding that there were people who were out to destroy the nation. Somebody's moving around in the back with the mute. I understand that with my knowledge, and I understood something about who the people who were doing this, because I had fought against them on issues of science and economy and so forth. Basic best way, since I was then in my 40s, to contribute to helping these young people, or at least some of them resist this corruption, was to teach. Since I was very good at economics, I decided to teach economics. Since on the campuses among the so-called New Left, the question of Marx was the rage, I decided to teach, when the opportunity was given in 1966, to teach a course on the subject of Marx and Marx's economics, and to teach my own views of the matter in that process, and to teach a number of other things. Okay, so that was how Lynn did what he did, and I think this is important because this should, I hope, correct what could be a misconception many people might have about Lyndon LaRouche. Lyndon LaRouche did not do what he did because he wanted to offer an alternate program to how to fix the United States economy. Lyndon LaRouche did not run because he wanted to become president of the United States. Lyndon LaRouche did not primarily locate himself in that sense in this intervention, even as a physical economist, though that's what he taught. He located his intervention as a need to destroy the culture that was destroying the society. Now, this is a critical thing to understand, because I will submit to you that I do not believe that it is possible to find among the present so-called transatlantic elite people who have the moral fitness to lead the nations of that area to survive, and that includes Donald Trump. That includes everybody. That doesn't mean that they can't do things that are useful, necessary, even decisive. It does not mean, for example, that persons such as ourselves are going to find their way to those positions of power, and therefore, in fact, someone is going to be in those positions of power who will use that power one way or the other. So as Ronald Reagan was organized by Lyndon LaRouche to adopt a policy which, had it been adopted, would mean that what we are now talking about and threatened by worldwide would not be there. That, in other words, where we are standing and what we find ourselves talking about tonight is something that we're in a sort of retrograde circumstance, a devolutionary circumstance, in which we are talking about something that was addressed by the presidency of the United States 40 years ago, shows the moral incompetence and unfitness of this group of people to survive. I think this has just got to be, first of all, faced, because when we faced it as an early organization during the period of the 1960s and 70s, many of us joined the organization because this was exactly the circumstance. And when Lyndon LaRouche ran for president in 1976 for the first time, and we attempted to prevent Jimmy Carter from becoming president because a vote for Carter was a vote for thermonuclear war, Carter, though he was defeated in the election, was frauded into office, and the threat of thermonuclear war was on. And it meant that in the aftermath of his election, it was necessary for us to do something new, something different, because the first thing that we had attempted to do while it had worked had not been acknowledged because of the vote fraud that occurred in that election. And so what occurred in that period was that as a result, in part of Lynn's campaign, he began to campaign, we were contacted by certain people who helped us to understand this idea of the possibility of creating an alternative to nuclear war, which became later the Strategic Defense Initiative, and Lynn fought with his organization to qualify Ronald Reagan and his presidency to initiate that, which was done against all of his advisors and against even the knowledge of a lot of the people who basically just presumed that it was no possible way that would ever occur, that policy could never be implemented by someone organizing the President of the United States to do it. And that was true of the Soviet Union, who vehemently opposed this, viscerally opposed this, as it was true of Henry Kissinger. Now, this is said because where we find ourselves tonight is that Helga Zepp-LaRouche has made a proposal, and she's got these 10 principles, and we'll talk about these 10 principles. But just to indicate something about what her ideas about these are, she says, the new paradigm, which will be characteristic of the new epoch, and toward which the new global security and development architecture must be directed, must eliminate the concept of oligarchism for good and proceed to organize the political order in such a way that the true character of humanity as the creative species can be realized. Therefore, I suggest that the following principles must be discussed, and if agreed upon, must be realized. These ideas are meant to be food for thought and a dialogue among all people concerned to find a basis for a world order guaranteeing the durable existence of the human species. Now, we're not going to read those principles right now. These you can find on our website, and what we are asking the people to do is actually read them and write down, respond to what she is asking. This is something that needs to be done by everybody, kind of like the topic posed back in July around the idea of the Declaration of Independence, that all Americans think about it this way, that she's writing something like the kind of way in which the drafts of the Declaration of Independence were meant to be read by the delegates. And the notion is that you actually respond to this, not merely, let's circulate as a petition. Let's call this a program. It's not a program. It's a conception. Now, to get this kind of process to happen, this can't just be a small number. The kind of thing that we're hearing from these people in the transatlantic world. We've got to uplift the population quickly to engage in an actual discussion of these 10 principles. Now, this means a mass discussion, not merely a few people in a little organization somewhere, whether that's our organization or it's a few people around Bernie Sanders or it's somebody else over in some other part of the blogosphere. That is not adequate. That is not going to stop, nor could it stop the headlong careening into war, because one has to understand that the culture in which we exist is inferior. And the things that people are thinking about and the entertainment that people have and the preoccupations they have make people morally inferior to being able to survive. We will not survive under the present circumstance unless population is uplifted. Now, we happen to be in the season of Advent and Christmas. And while a lot of people may not have thought about it, that's exactly the only thing and the only purpose of the so-called holiday called Christmas. I mean, the whole purpose of it is redemption. Redemption, if you look up the word, well, I don't like the idea of dictionary definitions, but it's helpful in this regard to recognize that the word redemption means to free oneself by paying for your freedom. I mean, it's exactly literally what slaves did in slavery. That's called redemption. And what you're looking at right now is that there's a need for this population these people in this country and in other countries to go through a redemptive process. Now, true, in the Christian story, the whole point of the story is that really you have to have a situation in which a singular individual who's volunteered for that mission carries that mission out on behalf of mankind, and that is an acknowledged identity of that. But see, that happened already. What's supposed to happen now, as Martin Luther King tried to emphasize, is that everybody's supposed to imitate that. But when you have a situation as you have in the present-day United States where people read, if you read the New York Post or one of these other unfortunate tabloids, you read about decapitations, people coming home and finding somebody with their head cut off. You read about people being pushed onto the subway. You read about serial killers. You read about this and that. You know, you can say, oh yeah, but I mean, but fundamentally we have a healthy society. No, you actually fundamentally have a doomed society, and you are not going to survive the doom in that society individually. It isn't going to happen. You are in a circumstance that requires redemption. And if you expect that to come from the political elites, well, the reason I read to you what I read from Lena LaRouche is there is no political elite that is qualified in the United States to meet that. It doesn't exist. Doesn't exist in Europe. They are too degenerate. So unless you and I can play that role, it can't happen. To this end, one of our members, Bill Ferguson, proposed some weeks ago now that an initiative be taken in which it's a piece of music be sung called Dona, Nobis, Pacem. I've asked that Bill come on, and also John Segerson, who has directed choruses for Schiller Institute and for the LaRouche movement for literally decades, and has thought a lot about this particular piece of music, that they come on and talk about this. And here's what I want to say about it, and then ask Bill to just take whatever time he needs to outline his idea, and then John will come in with why the content, this piece and content, is so powerful. Sometimes it's possible to mobilize the whole world, and you can mobilize the whole world to do the same thing at the same time. That's possible with this piece of music. It's possible because, first of all, because of the season. It's possible because of the danger of war. It's possible because of the need that people feel to get beyond the kind of cesspool of culture that they find themselves in. And more than that, it actually fortifies people. It's nonviolent, direct action, calling for not only the end of violence, but the superseding of violence. Now, until you get that, you can't have negotiations for peace. You can't have a development architecture. You can't have international cooperation. You can't have national peace. You can't have an absence of crime. You can't have an absence of drug use. You can't do anything about poverty because you don't have the fundamental condition in which the respect for the dignity of mankind, of an individual to individual, is strong enough to get rid of any of that. So you can do individual things in an individual locality or neighborhood, but you cannot defeat these problems. And that's why things get worse and worse and worse. But it is possible at some moments in history to mobilize everyone to pull in a certain direction. And that is what we are proposing be done by means of music and a means of this piece. So I wanted to ask Bill and John to sort of take it from here and just sort of go through this idea, lay out the discussion, and then if we have some questions about it in discussion or ideas about how to do it, then we would move to do that. So Bill, you're on, and you just go right ahead.
I think in the course of the discussions about the Fair for Senate campaign, somebody had raised the idea of holding a candlelight vigil to protest Diane's exclusion from the debate. And then when I heard that idea, it reminded me of the process of candlelight vigils that occurred in East Germany in 1989, that led to the process of ultimately the wall coming down and the reunification. I also remembered that in our organizing in Boston in the early 2000s, that we had about close to 20 LaRouche youth organizers here, and they had been chosen.
Bill, we're having a little bit of problem with your audio, not entirely. When you're speaking to, maybe speak directly into the phone. It's sort of when you said we had, and we didn't hear how many organizers you said. So just let you know. Go ahead.
All right. Can you hear me better now?
It's breaking up a little bit. Just go ahead. Try again. Let's see.
Okay. Yeah, there were about 20 young organizers here, and they came here. Well, before they came here on a more permanent basis, they had been deployed here for the 2004 Democratic National Convention, and there were, I believe at that time, there was about 100 young LaRouche organizers, and the main activity, aside from passing out literature and talking to people, was that they would be singing classical music at the different choke points where people were moving through to and from the convention. And this created a completely different environment that you usually have in those situations. Surrounding the convention with beauty. A few days after that, as we had begun the process of intervening on our congressional representatives to confront them on the fact that they were leading us to nuclear war, we held sort of a mini candlelight vigil outside the Harvard School of Government where Senator Markey was speaking. And while we were standing out there, I had a not very productive back and forth with a couple of Eastern European students, one who identified herself as being Ukrainian. And it struck to me that this discussion wasn't getting anywhere. And I wasn't trying to attribute to her any evil motives. I don't know what she thought of what I was saying. And the other person, also Eastern European, they were beginning to become hostile. But all I was proposing was that instead of a war, that there should be discussion to try to come to a resolution. And there was a lot of back and forth about historical wrongs and violations of rights and sovereignty and this sort of thing. But it just seemed that the dialogue was inadequate, that needed to be transcended. And then soon after that, I thought of the idea of, well, perhaps we could employ the classical music in the way that we had done before, and which had become a regular feature of the interventions of the youth movement here in the Boston area and also around the country and around the world. So that's why I had this idea that we could use that idea to intervene in the current situation. I mean, most people generally, if you get into any political discussions nowadays, or if you see what passes for dialogue in the social media, it could get pretty acrimonious and useless, just back and forth sniping and accusations. And then, of course, you have the above that the manipulations from different agencies to shut it down or shut down certain ideas. So the idea was that we could use this canon, Dona, Nobis, Pacem, grant us peace, as a theme to transcend the acrimony and bitterness and the hostility, to transcend it, to assert a different kind of principle, a dialogue principle. And let me just say that reading the 10 principles for the new international security and development architecture, looking at the 10th principle, I'll just read it. It's not that long. The 10th principle, as Mrs. LaRouche states it, the basic assumption for the new paradigm is that man is fundamentally good and capable to infinitely perfect the creativity of his mind and the beauty of his soul, and being the most advanced geological force in the universe, which proves that the lawfulness of the mind and that of the physical universe are in correspondence and cohesion, and that all evil is the result of a lack of development and therefore can be overcome. And that seems to me that's the heart of it right there. If that's the basis for the dialogue, if that's the basis for the discussions and the approach that we have, then we can reach the level of the coincidence of opposites, and we can overcome the problems, transcend this principle of violence, or all these other anti-human principles, as Dennis has been discussing. So let me stop there, and then maybe can take it up again later.
Okay, that's fine, Bill, because we're going to have discussion. I'll just repeat, and I was told by someone that the audio problem may be on my end. I'm not sure. I just want to therefore repeat the last of those points of the principles, and then let John go from there. So that was that number 10. The basic assumption for the new paradigm is that man is fundamentally good and capable of infinitely perfect the creativity of his mind and the beauty of his soul, and being the most advanced geological force in the universe, which proves that the lawfulness of the mind and that of the physical universe are in correspondence, in cohesion, and that all evil is the result of a lack of development and therefore can be overcome. I just wanted to repeat that so that if it may not just have been my audio, so just wanted to hear that. All right, so John, if you're there.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, please go ahead.
Okay. The eighth principle that Helga put out talks about the coincidence of opposites, a concept that developed by Nicholas of Cusa, who everybody listening to this call should read. Works of Cusa. What does it mean? Well, opposites. Well, how about this for an opposite? War and peace. There are two opposites. Can you have war and peace? Well, I don't know. I guess so. In the world today, you have some war and some peace. But really, ultimately, they're two completely diametrically different ideas. So therefore, when, in a certain way, if you say Dona, Nobis, Pacem, which is what we're discussing here, the question is, okay, what does this actually mean? Does it mean, going to some government and say, please give us peace? Well, first of all, that's not what the Dona, Nobis, Pacem is. Keep in mind that the original, it's the end of the Catholic Mass. It begins Agnus Dei, Lamb of God, qui tollis peccata mundi, who taketh away the sins of the world. Right. Dona, Nobis, Pacem. Right? Grant us peace. Not give us peace, but grant us peace. So it is the question of Christ, as Dennis said. This is a redemptive act of that also, by the way, you have the Lamb of God. Remember that in pre-Christian times, the lamb was something that you sacrificed. That's the idea of the sacrificial lamb, right? In the Abrahamic religions, that you sacrificed something that was valuable to you in order to please God. Whereas in this case, what we're talking about, again, not to get too theological, but we're talking about God sacrificing his own son. Why? Not to please God, but to save humanity. And that is exactly what is here. And so when we're talking about giving peace or granting peace, there are also two types of peace. And I think it's really interesting if you look at what Beethoven did when he wrote composed one of his greatest works, the Missa Solemnis, his solemn mass, which he wrote after at the same time that he was writing the Ninth Symphony, his great Ninth Symphony. He was sort of writing them in parallel. But in the final movement, actually it's not even in the final movement, the final section of the final movement of the Agnus Dei, he writes something at the top of the score, and I'll read it in German, which is Bitte inneren und äußeren Frieden, which means a plea for inner and outer or external peace. Because if you look at the Mass, per se, it emphasizes the inner part of the peace. Because frankly, I mean, inner peace is very, very important, and it is part of the thing. You cannot really have external peace with souls that are completely conflicted and in a state of complete either complete denial of their anti-human emotions, or who are in a state of it would be better if they're in a state of great internal conflict. But in order to actually create a process of something resembling peace, you have to have some kind of a question of inner peace. What's inside of you? What is your goal in life? What are you living for? Are you living just for yourself? Are you living just for your own children? What about all the other children who are dying around the world? Are you living for them? Are you working for them? Is this a great emotional concern to you? And it ought to be. And I know that everybody who joined with Lyndon in this movement joined on the basis of some sense of that. In my own case, I remember that and this was many years ago, but I remember that the main point was I was totally torn apart by what was going on in Africa, and that was in the 1960s, and it's even worse today. So, but you need a kind of inner peace in order to be able to deal with these things. But then Beethoven says, no, well, wait a minute, no, we have to have external peace as well. Now that's really something, because that really bridges the question that this is political. Keep in mind that Beethoven was writing this particular work, the Missa Solemnis. He was writing it for the monarchs of Europe. Specifically, he was sending it out to the monarchs of Europe, basically for them, because keep in mind that at that point it was a worsening situation for Europe. The American Revolution was not successful. Could not be reproduced in Europe. You had the horrors of the Napoleonic Wars, and it continued with the rise of the British Empire, playing one nationality against another, which was one of the ways we describe that is Lord Palmerston's zoo, with one group of one group, one ethnic group, or one cultural group being pitted against another, all on the behalf of the British, the rising power of the British Empire. So that's now. But coming back to this question of opposites, my view is that when we're talking about a peace in something like Dona Nobis Pacem, we're really not talking about peace. We're talking about something higher, because it's above peace and above war. I mean, that what we're and this really gets to what it is, because yes, we want a warlike stance against the degradation of culture. Lyndon LaRouche was the originator of an idea of a war on drugs in the 1980s, something that the government under George Bush actually helped shut down, that war against drugs. And we see the results of that today. The fact that there was that war against drugs was shut down, and it has destroyed more than one generation of young people at this point. So we need something higher than that, and I think this is exactly what Helga is getting at with these 10 principles, because the content of peace is precisely what these 10 principles are actually going through. And so I don't think it's war. I don't think it's just the kind of peace that you think about. I think this is something which is extremely exciting and extremely conflicted, if you might say. I might say that one other aspect of this is that when Nicholas of Cusa talks about the coincidence of opposites, he doesn't talk about it as some really wonderful thing that all of a sudden you're in paradise and everything's great. He does not talk about it that way at all. He wrote a little book towards the end of his life called The Vision of God. And he describes the coincidence of opposite as a wall, and that you have to face that wall. He actually says it's somewhat, just to read a little bit in The Vision of God, in terms of he talks about this coincidence of opposites. He says, hence I observe how needful it is for me to enter into the darkness and to admit the coincidence of opposites beyond all grasp of reason, and there to seek the truth where impossibility meeteth me. And beyond that, beyond even the highest ascent of intellect, when I shall have attained unto that which is unknown to every intellect, and which every intellect judges to be the most far removed from truth, there, my God, art thou, who art absolute necessity. And the more that dark impossibility is recognized as dark and impossible, the more truly doth his necessity shine forth, and it is more unveiledly present and draweth nigh. So, as you can see, for Cusa and for Helga and for Lyndon LaRouche, the idea of peace is not some nice flowery thing, some bleeding heart liberal type of, fantasy, something like that. It is a struggle for man to become truly man. So that to me is sort of the content of the peace. When I think about the Dona Nobis Pacem, that's what I think about. Now I want to talk about the specifics of this particular piece, Dona Nobis Pacem. I hope most people have recognized the tune. Dona Nobis, Nobis Pacem. That's the way it starts, and then it's a round, so that it can be done three ways, which is polyphonic, i.e., that you have different voices working and singing different lines, but at the same time, which even in a simple round like that is far superior to what most people are given today in terms of so-called music, where all it is some kind of background, usually electronically generated beat, and then some wailing, caterwauling that occurs. I mean, the kinds of stuff that you hear, even going around the supermarket and so forth. It's just this caterwauling, and it's just a single line. And sometimes the singer's a little bit better and sometimes a little bit worse, but it's really meaningless because there's never any polyphony. It's gone. Even something like, Sonny and Cher, going back to so-called classical rock or so forth. I Got You, Babe, or something like that, where they're singing back and forth to each other, but they're not really singing in any polyphony. There's no polyphony. And so even something as simple, seemingly as simple as the Dona Nobis Pacem, sung in round form, already is being able to get at something which is otherwise inaccessible to somebody who's been, it's completely different than what people are usually being subjected to as so-called music. But it goes way beyond that. The specific intervals that the Dona Nobis starts with, and for those people, pardon me if there's people who don't know much about music, but music does work on the basis of an ordered universe, you might say, of intervals, and each of them has different values. And so, and they have names. They're given names, but they go really way beyond the names. You have an octave, which is basically a kind of a doubling principle, and then you also have intervals within the scale. And the specific intervals that we have in the Dona Nobis, in the first three notes, it starts with so it's got three notes, and of course, if you have three notes, you have to have two intervals between them. And it's interesting that when people think about singing music, they think about the notes, whereas really they should be thinking about the intervals, because that's the action that's occurring. And music is all action. It's not things. So let's talk about the intervals. Well, one is the interval, what's called a fourth. Da-dee. Goes down a fourth. Da-da-da-da. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then it's followed by an interval which is called the sixth. Let me do that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So de da dee. Those are your basic intervals. What struck me thinking about this Dona Nobis Pacem is if you just take those three intervals and then you think about a number of pieces that the great composers, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert, the great songwriter, composed on those very intervals, you find something very interesting, is that almost all of the pieces that people have written about that are about love and about sacred love. I'm talking about not sexual love or carnal love. I'm talking about agape, the Greek idea of sacred love. And almost every single piece there's a large number of pieces that are based completely on that. Just to give you one example, Beethoven wrote this wonderful piece which is called Ich liebe dich, which means I love you. And it's about married love. And, the opening says, I love you as you love me, and there was never a time that we haven't shared our sorrows. And it ends saying, let God protect us both. That piece begins with the same interval, right? So Dona, and then it goes Nobis, right? On that, well, I'm going to sing the Ich liebe dich, the opening, of the Ich liebe dich. Ich liebe dich, so wie du mich am Abend und am Morgen. So you hear the difference? Da-dee, da-da-dee, da-dee. It's exactly based on the same intervals. Or Beethoven wrote this other wonderful quartet, a trio, which is called the Ghost Trio. It's Opus 70, number 1. And what he did there is, and it's the second movement is why it's called the Ghost Trio, because it sounds, keep in mind that the word ghost in German it's Geist, and Geist doesn't just mean ghost in terms of the spooky ghost. It also has the idea of Geist also means mind in German. It means both at the same time. But in this movement in the Ghost Trio, he takes the same intervals as the Dona, Nobis, Pacem, but then he turns it into a minor. I'll sing it. Da dee da. Instead of in the Dona, Nobis, Pacem, dee da dee. In the Ghost Trio, it's da dee dee, and then dum da 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 dee dum. You can go and look the piece up yourself, but it's basically on the same thing. But then, what's really interesting is that there are many, many other pieces which are based on what's called the inversion of those intervals. And this is where it gets really interesting. Okay, what do I mean by inversion? Well, if you take what's going up and turn it into what's going down, and you take what's going down and it's going up, that's one type of inversion. So let me just sing, okay? Na-dee-dum. Okay, so it's down a fourth, up a sixth. So now how about this? La-dee-dum. Up a fourth, down a sixth. Okay, very good. Okay, so now let's see. Okay, how about this? I'm going to change it because I want to lower it a little bit. How about na-dee-dum? Here we go, the same thing. Up a fourth, down a sixth. How about this? Ave, ave, verum corpus. That's Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus, one of the most incredible and incredibly intense pieces that you could have based on exactly those intervals, except inverted. Or how about this? Another piece by, again, the Ave Verum Corpus is the contemplation of the body of Christ and asking the question, can I imitate what he did? You know, what he did and for all mankind. But now, how about this? There's another piece. Auf dem Hügel sitz ich spähend, la-di-dum. That's the piece that Beethoven wrote, which is called To the Distant Beloved. This is Opus 98, Opus An die Ferne Geliebte. And then how about this? Another piece that Schubert wrote, same theme. Du holder Kunst, in wie viel grauen Stunden. That's Schubert's An die Musik. It's a beautiful ode to music and to the incredible love that music can evoke. I could go on and on with many, many other pieces. I think I should stop there to give you an idea of that. So what my thought on the Dona Nobis is that if this when a chorus is singing this, maybe what they should do is sing the Dona Nobis Pacem and then maybe sing the Ave Verum Corpus too, as a kind of a counterpoint to it, and get this idea and see if this can be the this idea of true polyphony and the inversion is very important, because inversion is a kind of irony when you're inverting something. It's really necessary in order to get an idea across, to have that kind of inversion. If we can get this kind of discussion going on along the lines of exactly these 10 principles that Helga has worked out, maybe we can get some idea. Maybe you can't put a name to it, but we can get some idea of what the real content of peace is.
Okay, I'm going to open up the queue for questions, and I'm going to get us started with a couple. Let's see here. Okay, so press *6 to get in to ask whatever question or comment you have. I want to say one thing about what we want to do with this, which is to create a kind of viral event. Now, this does not mean what one might think, which is let's get a video of the performance and get all kinds of people watching it. No, what we wanted to get all kinds of people actually performing it. And then, of course, they may have video. We may do video of it. But really the issue is more the idea that in church groups, in schools, and in various places, we encourage people to take this up. And now there's various things that one might ask, and I'm going to start with a couple questions I have, John, just about the piece, and just say a few things to people about what we want to do. Let's just take this thing you posed, John, just for the purpose of getting right into it. You referenced just now the Ave Verum of Mozart. I would like you to say a little bit about that. As I understand it, that was the last full composition that Mozart wrote. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. It was like a very condensed. It's a very short little piece, but it's extremely condensed, and Lynn and LaRouche. Lynn would like all of us who are working with him to focus on short pieces, because the very big pieces, they're really wonderful and so forth, but you can get lost in them. But if you want to deal with principles, it's better to start out with something short. It's like the same thing with poetry. You've got to start something very short, but very to the point. And this particular piece is like that. It also embodies something that I didn't even mention, which is that Mozart does something very special with those intervals right after it, because he doesn't go Ave, Ave. Instead, he throws in an extra note, or a different note. He goes Ave, Ave. And that note, it seems like it doesn't even fit, but it's what some people would call a dissonance, because it creates what's called a augmented fourth or diminished fifth. Which is what seemingly, it used to be called the devil's interval, but it's actually the angel's interval. The Aristotelians called it the devil's interval because they didn't like it. But much of great classical music, especially from Bach's discoveries of this, is based on the use of that particular interval as a kind of representation of the living nature of the musical system. Let me just leave it at that.
Okay, but obviously the other thing that I just like to point out is that this is written, after the Requiem, or rather, obviously the Requiem is not finished, and therefore it's one of the most advanced things that Mozart ever wrote. And it's interesting to think about the idea that the Dona Nobis Pacem, because you said you proposed what people should do with the Dona Nobis Pacem. The second piece that you can look at is this one. And the Dona Nobis is what you called a round. Can you tell people what you meant by a round? Because obviously a round and a canon are different. It might be useful just so we're being clear with people, what goes on. Because, of course, you didn't sing the entire piece. And you mentioned that it was in sort of three voices.
Yeah, well, a round is a simpler version of a canon. They're both saying the canon is more rigorous in terms of the relationship of the a round is basically three different lines which work together. A canon is a single line which works against itself, or works with itself, or against itself, however you want to put it. So that's really the difference between a round and a canon. The canon is a much more rigorously, actually the word canon means law in Latin. Right? So a canonical scholar is and something that's canonical has to do with lawfulness. And precisely these canons were especially developed by Bach, and some of his greatest works were basically either working through certain canons and then working through the implications of that. Generally, if you ever want to work on a musical idea, the first thing you should do is to write a little canon based on it, because then you can figure out get a geometrical image in your mind rather than a sonic image. You can get a geometrical image in your mind of exactly the nature of the intervals that you're working with.
Okay, one thing I would just like to say as we're going through this, by the way, again, press *6 if you have a question, comment. We need people who can sing. First of all, people that have been in the choruses, the various Schiller choruses or other choruses for that matter. We need you to help us help people who will volunteer to do this or will themselves be thinking about it. I mean, obviously people have various kinds of holiday programs they're going to be involved with, or churches are going to be putting on, or maybe some schools are going to have them. Of course, more schools should have them, particularly given all of the problems that are going on. But they may not think that they've got people competent to either lead the process or assist with the singing, or maybe help a music teacher who's otherwise beleaguered. So those of you who are listening, who've been in choruses or otherwise have been active musically, should get in touch with us, either by getting on right here and telling us what you can do, or otherwise contacting various organizers. The second thing we're going to definitely do is to put a word out to the Catholic Church on this, because you had Pope Francis who's talked about the idea of using the Vatican as the location for peace talks on the Ukraine war. And there, for various reasons, there are things that can be done through the Catholic Church where everybody could be that's planning to go to church, Mass and so on, and this is the season where that happens. I mean, this is the Advent season. The first Sunday of Advent was this past Sunday. There are 4 Sundays prior to Christmas. And each one of them is supposed to be a commemoration of the 4 virtues, which hope, I think, was this past week. And we have faith, and you have love, and you have peace. That's what they are. So that's just something to think about